In this video, we're going to talk about hedione, one of the most famous molecules in modern perfumery. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the history, the chemistry, what it actually smells like, how you can use it in your perfume formulas, and finally, the pheromone effects that it's believed to have. So stay tuned to this video to learn about hedione. Okay then, so hedione, widely regarded as the most influential molecule in the 21st century in perfumery. Where did it all begin? Well, it was first synthesized in 1958, but the story begins in 1957. And what basically happened was Edward de Mol, who was a chemist working for Perfumery, which is one of the biggest fragrance companies in the world, he was doing his PhD. And as part of his PhD, he was studying jasmine and the components of jasmine, trying to work out the things that are inside it. You can imagine this is something that's really important to a big fragrance company like Perfumery, especially given that at the time, almost all perfumes made use of jasmine natural, which is a very expensive natural product. So you can imagine if you're a company like Firmenich and all of your perfumes are using jasmine, or at least a lot of them, it would be great if you could have a cheap way of getting this same jasmine smell. So they decided to invest a lot of resources in, well, if we can work out what's inside of jasmine, then maybe we can reconstruct a really good jasmine and avoid using the expensive natural, rather make a synthetic base ourselves, which is nice and cheap, and therefore that solves a lot of our problems. Anyway, as part of this investigation, Edouard discovered this molecule called methyl jasmone. And at the time, this was seen as a pretty good discovery because perfumers at Firmenich basically agreed this was a really good jasmine constituent, or a constituent that could be used in a jasmine base because it smelled really nice and jasmine-y and very sweet. So it had all of the kind of characteristics that they were looking for. Now, in chemistry, when you are looking for molecules, especially in perfumery, one thing you might like to do is make something called an analog, which is basically a very similar molecule where one thing is changed. And usually it's quite easy to do because you've got your set of reactions and you just have to change or add one step somewhere along the line to get an analog. Now, as part of this investigation, what they basically did was make the dihydro analog of this methyl jasmone. So they made methyl dihydrojasmone. And at the time when they made this, they didn't think actually that it was quite as good as the methyl jasmone. However, the guy in charge at Firmenich did see some potential in it because he thought, well, it does have a lot of the good qualities of the methyl jasmone, maybe not all of them, but it is a lot cheaper, a lot more economical, so there could be a good business prospect here. So what they basically did was they started sending samples of this methyl dihydrojasmone, which is the molecule we now know as hedione, and they started sending that to perfume houses, places like Dior. Now, initially it wasn't really used that much, but it did start to get used, but it was used in very small amounts just to give little boosts to a perfume. What happened, however, over the decades was perfumers slowly started to realize that this molecule could be used in higher and higher doses than they previously thought. And through the decades, the usage levels of this hedione slowly crept up, the number of perfumes that it was used in slowly crept up, and with this, the price of it also went down, which encouraged people to use it even more. And by the 2000s, that kind of time, perfumes were being released with hedione up to over 50% of the formula, which if you think about it is kind of crazy because when you think of a perfume, you think there's a lot of things together. So to have more than 50% of the formula of one thing, that's quite a big statement. But we'll go into this a bit more in the evaluation part of the video. I'll talk about what it actually smells like and what it does to a formula, and that will probably help you understand a bit more why it's used up to 50% in the formula. In the last section, I accidentally said methyl jasmone instead of methyl jasmonate, and the same for the dihydro version. Sorry, I was a bit tired when I recorded that. But in this section, I'm quickly going to explain where that chemical naming actually comes from because it might seem a little bit confusing sometimes. And then I'm also going to quickly explain how we get to hedione from that. Okay, so let's first start with the molecule jasmone. Now, this molecule is simply called jasmone because when it was first discovered, it was discovered inside the oil extracted from the jasmine flowers. So the next stage in this naming thing is this dihydro part. Now, what dihydro essentially means is you've added two hydrogens, so di meaning two and hydro for hydrogen. So when you do some kind of dihydrogenation reaction, you're essentially adding two hydrogens. Now, in the case of jasmine, when you add these two hydrogens, they go into the double bond that's on the tail of the molecule, making dihydrojasmone. Right, so now we've got the dihydro part, we just need to add the methyl and the 8 to the name. So firstly, what we're going to do is now add on a carboxylic acid group, or this double bond oxygen and then single bond OH. So this is a common group in chemistry. And when you add that group to a molecule, what you get is something called a carboxylic acid version of it. So we can now go and call the molecule dihydrojasmonic acid. Then finally, another very common reaction you can do in chemistry is to take a carboxylic acid and an alcohol and then do an esterification to get an ester out of them. So in this case, we take our dihydrojasmonic acid and we would put it together with methanol, and then out of that you get methyl dihydrojasmonate. So that's where the methyl comes from, and when you make an ester, you also put an 8 at the end. And this methyl dihydrojasmonate, that is hedione. So hedione is the common name given to it. I think in this case, the reason hedione was chosen is because it translates to the Greek hedon, which roughly means things like pleasure. So I guess it's meant to be a marketing thing that, yeah, this molecule is really, really nice. Okay then, so enough about the chemistry. What does it actually smell like? Well, the interesting thing about hedione is the first time I smelled it, and I'm sure it's the same for a lot of other people, is you don't actually necessarily smell anything at all, which can be really, really annoying because you've heard about this molecule, wow, it's so famous, it's used in all these different things, and then you try to smell it and you suddenly can't smell anything. In fact, it probably took me about a year or so of properly learning to smell hedione and really getting much more familiar with it. Now when I smell it really strongly, but that's just because I trained my nose to smell it over time. So if you can't smell hedione yourself and you're having trouble with it, do know that if you train your nose, and I'll talk about this in a second, but there is also some techniques you can use to help yourself smell it better. Don't worry about it. It's something that you will be able to smell eventually. Just don't be shocked if you open the bottle and you can't smell it. Actually, even the famous perfumer Jacques Cavelier had a story about not being able to smell it himself straight away. When he was a young kid, his father, who was also a perfumer, came home with this blotter or scent strip of hedione for the first time, and he said, "Hey, smell this." And Jacques was saying back to his dad, "Hey, what is this thing? I can't smell it. What is this?" And his dad said to him, "Go put this beside your bed and then tell me in the morning what you think of it." So Jacques went to sleep with his hedione beside him, and in the morning he said he woke up and could smell like fields of jasmine everywhere that was just really nice, but without that kind of indolic animalic side to the jasmine, and he suddenly realized, wow, this thing is pretty incredible. Now, for the video, I actually did try this as well. I did put some hedione in a scent strip last night on my bed, and I've got to say I didn't wake up smelling fields of jasmine. However, for sure, in the morning, you can smell it, and it's definitely, you can smell it more than when you first put it on the scent strip. Anyway, if you're having trouble smelling hedione yourself, there could be a couple of reasons. So firstly, when you smell raw materials pure, in their pure form, straight out of the bottle, most of the time I find they're too strong and they actually completely block out all of your receptors in your nose. They just bombard them, and it means you just can't smell anything, which is weird to think. When something's strong, you think it should smell really strong. But actually in perfumery a lot, if things are too strong, then you can't smell them at all. And like any other aroma chemicals or raw materials, this will happen with hedione. So you can't really smell it necessarily easily out of the bottle. But the other thing with hedione is it's a very transparent note in perfumery, and it's also not a dominant note, it's more of something that's in the background. And what this means is when you put it on a scent strip, if you've already pre-diluted it down in your perfume as alcohol or your ethanol, it means that all you really smell straight away is the ethanol. What you actually have to do is wait for the ethanol or the perfume as alcohol to evaporate off. So that's why I've dipped these in over here and just left them behind me. And then after about 10 minutes or so, when the alcohol's evaporated off, then you should be able to smell the hedione itself a lot more clearly. Again, even if you've diluted it down already, it's going to be hard to smell it from the bottle because the bottle's just going to smell like ethanol for the same reason. I would really recommend getting some scent strips for Hedione, and I would recommend diluting it down to 10% and then basically dipping it in, leaving it 15 minutes to an hour. You could even leave it overnight if you want, and then going to smell it, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to smell it. So what does it smell like when you finally kind of notice what it smells like? Well, what I find that it smells like is, and I'll use the examples I have here. So this one is at 1%. Now to me, this is quite floral, and it just smells kind of perfumey. And what I mean by that is it smells a bit like, when you go to a department store and you have that kind of sparkly perfume smell. It smells a bit like that. And it's not too strong, especially at 1% like I've got it here. However, if you then take the 10% one, which I've got next to it, this one for sure is a lot stronger, and you really notice what it smells like on its own. So at 10%, Hedione, to me, it smells very sweet, and it's got that kind of floral jasmine-y aspect to it, but it doesn't smell just like jasmine. Basically, the way I would describe it is it's got this sweet, floral kind of warmth and body to it, while at the same time being quite transparent and in the background. It kind of provides this just general aura, you could say. It's got this general feeling to itself. And it's also got these nuances of kind of maybe hay and kind of citrus, those kind of things. It does feel light and refreshing, but also sweet. So it's this nice balance of being sweet, but without being maybe sickly sweet, you might say. And it also does remind me just a little bit of galaxolide, which is a musk. And this is kind of interesting because Sophia Grossman, who made something called the Grossman Accord, which is a very famous accord used in perfumery. In that accord, she also uses Hedione and galaxolide together, also with isoe super and alpha methyl ionone to make that accord. But maybe there's some kind of harmony as well there. But the thing about Hedione is that it just seems to work so well in everything, because it's not this dominant note that goes and overpowers the perfume. Rather, you could see it as this kind of thing, like in the background, or as this kind of lens or this filter that's applied to the whole perfume. So it kind of takes what you've got, and usually it emphasizes it or exalts it or adds projection, maybe makes it smell sweeter or stuff like that, but it usually doesn't combat and provide this loud, shouty, distinctive smell that has a tendency to clash with other things. And I think that's the reason that Hedione is used so widely in so many perfumes, because most of the time you add Hedione in and it makes your perfume smell better, or it adds some character to it, or emphasizes something without clashing. It's very rare that you put Hedione in a formula and it smells worse, or you think, oh, this doesn't work very well. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes it can give you this kind of generic florally smell that smells like a lot of other perfumes, that maybe you've got a certain character in your perfume and the Hedione actually can dull it away. But a lot of the time you find adding Hedione to the perfume really can help.
Right, so now we've talked about how Hedione smells on its own. Let's talk a little bit how you can use it in your formulas. So the thing about Hedione, as I mentioned before, is you can really use it at a lot of different levels. Let's start off with an example for a new perfume which I just finished making, which I haven't yet released, but I will do soon. So in this case, I'm using Hedione, but at a very low level, at 0.1%. And this is a bit closer to the classical level at which Hedione may have been used when it first came out, when they didn't quite realize yet the power it had and what it could do to fragrances. The reason that I used it at such a low level in this perfume was quite simply that the effect it had on the character was in the wrong direction for what I wanted. So in this case, my perfume was very dry and woody, but the Hedione tried to make it sweet and floral, which really kind of ruined it in a sense and flattened out some of the notes that I created with the other raw materials. That said, however, at this level it does seem to still provide a little bit of a boost in the mid-note region and help provide a little bit of projection, and that's the reason that I still decided to use it. So the only point I'm trying to make here is really that even at a low level, Hedione still can have a large effect on your perfume. Next, we're going to have a look at some existing perfumes through the decades and look at the levels of Hedione in those, so you can get an idea of how the usage of Hedione evolved, but also give you some inspiration at the levels that you might want to use it in your formula. So let's start with Eau Sauvage, released in 1966, created by Edmond Rudnitska. Now, this was only 8 years after Hedione had initially been released to the market, And in this case, he used 2.5%, which at the time would have been seen as a very high usage of Hedione. But the perfume was very successful, and it's probably the first example of Hedione being used as quite a big component of the formula, as opposed to just one of these supporting elements in a jasmine accord. Fast forward 32 years, however, and we reach 1998. And in 1998, Odeur 53 was released by Comme des Garçons. And in this perfume, a whopping 65% of the formula was Hedione. Now, the point I'm trying to make with this is that you really can put Hedione this high to more than half of the formula. So I haven't tried it myself, but you can use a massive amount of Hedione. Next, we have Olivier Cresp, who's another well-regarded perfumer. He used Hedione at 20% in the formula for light blue, and he reiterates himself that you can use Hedione from anywhere down from like 2 or 3% to something more in the middle, like 12%, or you can go all the way up to 40 or 50%. Finally, we have Alberto Morelas, who used it at 25% in his Acqua di Gio in 1996. And he says that you can use Hedione together with bergamot and callone, which is a fresh aquatic raw material. And if you blend them together, it gives you the scent of summertime. So this is definitely an accord to try out if you're looking for something to do with Hedione.
Now, finally, to wrap up, we're going to discuss the neurochemistry, or the studies that were done on the effect of Hedione on the brain and the biological responses of it. Now, you may ask, why is this even a question or a topic that we're going to talk about? Because we're talking about perfumery raw materials here. Now, one question that's commonly asked about raw materials in perfumery is, do they just smell nice, or can they actually have some kind of effect to literally kind of attract people? And one of the ways that it's proposed that this might happen is, well, in animals there are these things called pheromones. Now, what are pheromones, you may ask? Well, basically they're these molecules which have been shown, especially in animals, to provide these kind of social effects. There's one example in humans where, for example, it was shown in a study that the tears of women actually had this effect in men to kind of suppress the sexual response or the arousal response. And the mechanism of this is proposed that there's some kind of pheromone or molecule in these tears that come from sadness, which can be recepted by someone else, and that can trigger a hormonal response in them. Now, in the case of Hedione, there was actually a study which was trying to figure out if Hedione may have one of these pheromone effects as well. And it was quite interesting because the study that they did, they actually kind of concluded that it very well may do. Anyway, what happened was there are these receptors in the brain which are in something called the limbic system, which is quite heavily associated with things like emotions. And there are these receptors called the VN1R1 receptors, which are, I think, in animals shown to be pheromone receptors, so they can have these pheromone effects. And there was a study looking at Hedione and some other molecules binding to these receptors in the brain. Now, what the study showed was that this Hedione may actually exhibit some kind of response in the hypothalamus that's associated with releasing hormones. So you can imagine that might be some kind of sexual response. And it also found that that response that was measured was higher in women for whatever reason than men, though it still was there to some degree in men. So overall, the kind of conclusions that were made from this study was indeed Hedione may actually provide some kind of pheromone effects or some kind of sexually attracting effects outside of it just simply smelling nice. Now, I would say that this study didn't seem to be massive, and I think it would definitely be good to have more data, so more studies with more participants to maybe study a bit more the nuances of this and to back it up. But for sure, it's a very interesting avenue of scientific exploration. So I would just say to kind of keep this in mind when you're using Hedione. It is actually possible that there may be some kind of effect, some kind of attracting effect that is more than simply it smelling nice. And potentially this could be one of the reasons that it's so successful in perfumery. So I'll leave this one for you to decide for yourself, but just know that that research exists. Anyway, that's about it from me. That's the video. Hope you learned something interesting about Hedione today, and especially if you've had trouble using Hedione or never really used it in your perfumes or wanted a bit more advice on maybe how you could use Hedione. hopefully this gives you a bit more of an idea that basically, Hedione's this thing. You can try adding it to a lot of different of your perfumes you make and seeing what effects it has. And it can have a lot of different effects, from increasing projection to adding sweetness and just acting as a general modifier, floralizer, sweetener to your perfumes. So once again, thank you for watching the video, and please do consider commenting, liking, subscribing. If there are other raw materials you would like me to do a video on, do put those in the comments, because I do read the comments and often I do suggestions from things in the comments in some of my future videos. So have a great week and thank you for watching. See you next time.